May 8, 1945. The war in Europe had ended hours before. In the rubble-strewn streets of Frankfurt, beneath skies still gray with the residue of recent fire, a German woman named Ilse Hartmann stood at what remained of her kitchen window. The glass had shattered weeks ago during an air raid. The frame hung crooked, blackened by soot. She was 34 years old, though the mirror, cracked and leaning against the wall, told her she looked 50. Her hands, calloused and trembling, clutched a piece of stale bread. It was all she had eaten that day. Around her, the city breathed in shallow gasps. Buildings leaned like dying men. The smell of cordite and decay clung to everything. Children with hollow eyes sat on broken stones, waiting for something, though no one could say what. In the distance, American jeeps rumbled through the streets, their engines of foreign sound, mechanical and confident. Ilse watched them pass, her face blank, her mind unable to grasp what came next. For 12 years, she had been told that the enemy was savage, barbaric, godless. That the Americans were gangsters and capitalists who cared for nothing but money and themselves. Now they were here. And she did not know what to expect. The collapse of the Third Reich had not been sudden, though its final days felt like the snapping of a rope pulled too tight for too long. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a nation unraveling. The Eastern Front had crumbled. Soviet forces pushed through Prussia and Silesia with a fury born of years of suffering. In the West, American and British armies crossed the Rhine, driving deep into the heart of the fatherland. Cities that had once been symbols of industrial power, Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, lay in ruins. Factories were silent. Railways were twisted metal. The population, already starved by years of rationing, now faced a reality more bitter than hunger, defeat. For German civilians, the end of the war was not liberation. It was the beginning of a reckoning. They had lived for years under a regime that promised greatness, strength, unity. They had been told that their sacrifices, sons sent to the front, food surrendered to the state, lives bent to the will of the Führer, would build a 1,000-year empire. Instead, they inherited ash. The propaganda that had saturated their lives, that had blared from radios and plastered across cinema screens, had promised that the enemy would bring annihilation. That the Americans, if they came, would loot and rape and destroy. That the soldiers of democracy were no better than bandits. And so, as the Americans rolled into the western zones, German civilians braced themselves for retribution. But what arrived was something else entirely. Something they could not understand. Something that did not fit into the narrative they had been fed for more than a decade. On the evening of May 9, 1945, in the town of Wiesbaden, a group of American soldiers established a temporary command post in the remains of a municipal building. The town had surrendered without a fight. Its streets were quiet, populated by civilians who moved like ghosts, eyes downcast, bodies bent with exhaustion. The Americans set up tents, unloaded supplies, and began the work of occupation. As dusk fell, something unusual happened. From the American camp, a soft glow began to emerge. Candles. Dozens of them. Small flames flickering in the twilight, arranged in rows along the perimeter of the camp. The soldiers stood in silence, heads bowed. There was no shouting, no celebration. Just the quiet presence of light in the gathering dark. German civilians, watching from broken windows and doorways, did not understand what they were seeing. Some thought it was a military ritual. Others feared it was preparation for something worse. But as the minutes passed and the candles continued to burn, curiosity began to overcome fear. A few ventured closer. An elderly man with a limp. A young mother holding the hand of a small child. They stood at the edge of the camp, uncertain, waiting to be turned away. Instead, an American soldier, a young man from Ohio with dirt under his nails and exhaustion in his eyes, looked up and nodded. He did not speak German. He did not need to. He gestured to the candles, to the silence. And then he said, in halting, broken words, "For the dead, all the dead." The candlelight vigil was not an isolated event. In the weeks and months following the German surrender, American forces across the occupied zones began holding evening services. They were not official ceremonies, not mandated by command. They arose organically, from soldiers who carried with them the traditions of home. Many of these men were Christians, Protestants and Catholics who had grown up in small towns and cities across America, where candlelight vigils were held in churches and town squares to honor the fallen, to pray for peace, to mark moments of collective grief. In the chaos of war, they brought that tradition with them. They lit candles for their own dead, for brothers and friends who had fallen at Normandy, in the Ardennes, in the bloody push through France and Germany. But they also lit candles for others, for the civilians caught in the crossfire, for the victims of the camps, for the German soldiers who had died believing in a lie. It was a small act, quiet and simple, but to the German civilians who witnessed it, it was incomprehensible. They had expected conquerors. Instead, they saw mourners. They had expected wrath. Instead, they saw reverence. And in that contrast, something began to shift. Ilse Hartmann ventured to the American camp on the third night of the vigil. She did not know why she went. Perhaps it was hunger that drove her, the faint hope that the Americans might have food to spare. Perhaps it was curiosity, the need to see for herself whether the stories she had been told were true. She walked slowly, her shoes worn through at the soles, her coat too thin for the evening chill. When she reached the edge of the camp, she stopped. The candles were arranged in neat rows, each one burning steadily despite the breeze. Soldiers stood among them, silent, their heads bowed. Some held rifles at their sides. Others clasped their hands. One man, older than the rest, held a small Bible. He read from it in a low voice, the words carried away by the wind. Ilse did not speak English. She did not understand the prayer. But she understood the tone, the solemnity, the grief. She had heard that tone before, in churches, in funeral processions, in the voices of mothers who had lost sons. It was the sound of sorrow, and it was the same in every language. She stood there for a long time, watching. No one approached her. No one told her to leave. When she finally turned to go, one of the soldiers, a young man with red hair and freckles, stepped forward. He held out a piece of bread. Not stale, like the crumbs she had eaten that morning, but soft and fresh, wrapped in cloth. He offered it to her without a word. She hesitated, then took it. He nodded, and returned to the vigil. Ilse walked home in the dark, the bread clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She did not know why she was crying. She did not know what any of it meant. But something inside her, something that had been locked tight for years, had begun to crack open. The impact of these vigils on German civilians was documented in the months that followed. American military government officials, tasked with managing the occupied zones, began to notice a shift in attitude. In their reports, they noted that German civilians, who had initially been withdrawn and fearful, were beginning to engage with the occupying forces. They asked questions. They accepted food. They attended informational sessions about democracy and governance. In one report from June 1945, an officer in the town of Heidelberg wrote, "The civilians here are beginning to show signs of trust. They do not understand us, but they are watching. They see that we do not behave as they were told we would. They see that we honor our dead, that we mourn, that we do not celebrate their suffering. It is a small thing, but it is something. Another report, from a chaplain stationed in Munich, described a conversation with a German woman who had witnessed a candlelight vigil. She told him, through a translator, that she had believed Americans were without souls, that they were machines, driven by greed and violence. But the vigil had confused her. "Why do you mourn?" she asked. "You won." The chaplain explained that Americans mourned because life was sacred. That victory did not erase grief. That even in war, there was room for reverence. The woman did not respond. But the next evening, she returned to the camp with her daughter. They stood at the edge of the vigil, silent, watching the candles burn. It was a small moment, recorded in passing. But it was part of a larger transformation. The expectation versus reality divide was profound. For years, German civilians had been fed a steady diet of propaganda designed to dehumanize the enemy. American soldiers were portrayed as criminals and brutes, representatives of a degenerate culture obsessed with materialism and devoid of honor. The Nazi regime had painted a picture of the United States as a place of chaos, where racial mixing and capitalist exploitation had created a society on the brink of collapse. German civilians, many of whom had never met an American, believed these stories because they had no reason not to. The regime controlled the newspapers, the radio broadcasts, the films. Dissent was dangerous. And so, when the Americans arrived, the expectation was clear. They would come with violence. They would punish. They would take. Instead, they came with candles, with bread, with prayer. It was a profound dislocation. The soldiers they met did not match the monsters they had imagined. They were young men, tired and far from home, who spoke of mothers and sweethearts and the farms they missed. They shared rations with children. They helped clear rubble. They organized medical care for the wounded. And at night, they lit candles. For German civilians, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some clung to the old beliefs, insisting that the kindness was a trick, a manipulation designed to lull them into compliance. But others, like Ilse Hartmann, began to question. If the Americans were not what they had been told, what else had been a lie? The historical evidence of these vigils is scattered but consistent. Photographs from the period show American soldiers gathered in small groups, candles in hand, often in the ruins of German towns. Letters sent home by soldiers describe the practice. One letter, written by a soldier named Robert Mitchell from Pennsylvania, read, "Tonight we held a vigil for the boys we lost. Lit candles in the square. Some of the German civilians came to watch. They didn't say anything, just stood there. I think they were surprised that we cared. Hell, I was surprised too. But it felt right. After all this death, it felt right to stop and remember." Another letter, from a chaplain named Thomas O'Brien, described a vigil held in the town of Freiburg. He wrote, "We gathered at dusk and lit candles for the fallen. Germans watched from the shadows. When we finished, an old man approached me. He said nothing, but he placed a small wooden cross at the foot of the candles. I don't know who it was for. His son, maybe. But it was his way of joining us, of acknowledging the shared grief." These small acts of participation, these moments where German civilians began to engage with the rituals of the occupiers, were signs of a deeper shift. They were the first steps toward reconciliation. The transformation that occurred in the months and years following the war was slow and uneven. Germany remained a broken nation, divided first by occupation zones and later by ideology. But in the western zones, where American forces held sway, something new began to take root. It was not forgiveness. Too much had been done, too much had been lost, for forgiveness to come easily. But it was a recognition that the enemy was human, that grief was universal, that even victors carried wounds. The candlelight vigils became a symbol of that recognition. They were not grand gestures. They did not erase the horrors of the war or the crimes of the regime. But they created space for something other than hatred. They created space for mourning. And in mourning, there was the possibility of healing. For German civilians, the vigils represented the beginning of a new understanding. They saw that the Americans, for all their power and abundance, were not invincible. They grieved. They remembered. They carried the weight of their own losses. And in that shared vulnerability, a bridge began to form. The symbolic object that emerged from this period was the candle itself. In German culture, candles had long been associated with Christmas, with warmth, with home. But in the context of the post-war vigils, they took on a new meaning. They became symbols of endurance, of light in darkness, of life persisting despite death. German civilians who had lived through years of blackout regulations, who had hidden in basements while bombs fell, who had watched their cities burn, understood the power of a single flame. It was fragile, easily extinguished. But when many flames burned together, they could push back the dark. The Americans, with their candlelight vigils, offered that light, not as conquerors, but as fellow mourners. And slowly, hesitantly, German civilians began to accept it. In the town of Mainz, a German woman named Hilda Fischer began attending the vigils regularly. She did not speak to the soldiers. She simply stood at the edge, watching the candles burn. One evening, she brought a candle of her own. She lit it from one of the American candles and placed it among the others. A soldier noticed and smiled. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The gesture spoke for itself. By the autumn of 1945, the vigils had become a fixture in many occupied towns. German civilians began to contribute. They brought flowers, small crosses, photographs of their own dead. The vigils evolved from American rituals into shared ceremonies, spaces where the line between victor and vanquished blurred, if only for a moment. The abundance that characterized the American presence in occupied Germany extended far beyond the vigils. German civilians, accustomed to years of rationing and scarcity, were astonished by the sheer quantity of resources the Americans brought with them. Food, medicine, fuel, clothing, all arrived in steady streams, distributed through military government channels and relief organizations. The contrast with their own deprivation was stark. Before the war, Germany had been a prosperous nation, its industry the envy of Europe. But years of total war had stripped the country bare. By 1945, the average German civilian survived on fewer than 1,000 calories a day. Children suffered from rickets and malnutrition. The elderly died quietly in their homes, too weak to seek help. Into this landscape of want came the Americans, with their trucks full of supplies, their field kitchens serving hot meals, their medics treating the sick and wounded without distinction. It was overwhelming. German civilians, who had been taught that the Americans were driven solely by profit, could not reconcile the propaganda with the reality. Why would the victors feed the vanquished? Why would they share their abundance? The answer, though simple, was difficult for many Germans to grasp. Because they could. Because in the American worldview, shaped by democratic ideals and a sense of moral responsibility, helping those in need was not weakness. It was strength. The emotional contrast between expectation and reality deepened as the occupation continued. In the town of Darmstadt, a German schoolteacher named Klaus Becker attended one of the American vigils in late May 1945. He had lost his brother on the Eastern Front and his father in an air raid. He came to the vigil not out of sympathy for the Americans, but out of a desperate need to be near something that resembled order, ritual, meaning. He stood at the back, arms crossed, his face hard. He watched the soldiers bow their heads, watched the candles flicker in the breeze. He listened to the chaplain recite a prayer in English. And then, unexpectedly, he began to cry. He had not cried for his brother. He had not cried for his father. He had held himself together through the collapse of everything he knew, through the surrender, through the arrival of the occupiers. But standing there, surrounded by the quiet grief of strangers, he broke. An American soldier, noticing his distress, approached. The soldier did not speak German, but he placed a hand on Klaus's shoulder and stood with him, silent, until the tears subsided. Klaus never learned the soldier's name, but he never forgot the gesture. Years later, in an interview conducted by a historian documenting the post-war period, Klaus described that moment as the beginning of his transformation. "I hated them," he said. "I hated the Americans for winning, for being there, for making us confront what we had become. But that soldier, he did not hate me. He saw a man in pain, and he responded with kindness. It was the first time in years that anyone had shown me kindness without expecting something in return." The documented quotes from the period reveal the depth of this transformation. In a report from the American military government dated July 1945, an officer stationed in Stuttgart wrote, "The civilians are beginning to understand that we are not here to punish them, but to rebuild. They see the vigils, the distribution of food, the medical care, and they are confused. They ask, why? And we tell them, because it is the right thing to do. Because democracy means caring for the dignity of every person, even those who were your enemies." Another report, from a social worker attached to a relief organization, described a conversation with a group of German women. She wrote, "They told me they had expected us to be cruel, that they had been taught that Americans were selfish and brutal. But they said the vigils changed their minds. They said, 'You mourn, like we mourn. You are human.'" It was such a simple realization, but for them it was profound. These moments of recognition, repeated across hundreds of towns and thousands of interactions, formed the foundation of a new relationship between occupier and occupied. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. The transformation was not universal. There were German civilians who remained bitter, who clung to the old ideologies, who saw the American kindness as weakness or manipulation. There were those who refused to attend the vigils, who turned away when offered food, who believed that accepting help from the enemy was a betrayal. But they were a minority. Most Germans, exhausted by war and desperate for stability, began to accept the new reality. They attended the vigils. They took the food. They watched the American soldiers and saw not monsters, but men. And slowly, the narrative that had shaped their lives for 12 years began to crumble. The Candlelight vigils, small and simple as they were, played a part in that collapse. They offered an alternative to hatred. They demonstrated that the victors could be merciful, that democracy was not just a political system, but a way of being in the world, that even in the aftermath of catastrophe, there was room for compassion. By the winter of 1945, the vigils had become part of the rhythm of life in the occupied zones. They were held regularly, often on Sunday evenings, in town squares and churchyards and makeshift camps. German civilians no longer watched from a distance. They participated. They brought candles, flowers, handwritten notes. They stood alongside the American soldiers, heads bowed, sharing in the silence. It was a small thing, perhaps, a few candles in the dark. But in a world that had been consumed by violence, it was everything. It was a declaration that life mattered, that memory mattered, that the dead, whether German or American, deserved to be honored. And in that declaration, there was the seed of something new. Not reconciliation, Not yet. But the possibility of it. The beginning of a shared humanity. Ilse Hartmann continued to attend the vigils through the summer and into the fall. She never spoke to the soldiers. She simply came, stood among the candles, and let the light wash over her. One evening in October, as the air turned cold and the leaves began to fall, she brought her daughter. The girl was 8 years old, thin and quiet, with eyes that had seen too much. They stood together at the edge of the vigil, mother and daughter, watching the flames dance in the wind. The chaplain recited a prayer. The soldiers bowed their heads. And Ilse, for the first time since the war began, felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, easily broken. But it was there. She looked down at her daughter and saw that the girl was watching the candles with wide eyes. "Why do they do this, Mama?" the girl asked. Ilse did not know how to answer. But after a moment, she said, "Because they remember. Because they believe that remembering matters." The girl nodded, as if that made sense. And perhaps it did. Perhaps, in a world that had forgotten so much, remembering was the first step toward rebuilding. The epilogue of this story is not one of triumph, but of transformation. The candlelight vigils did not end the occupation. They did not erase the crimes of the Third Reich. They did not bring back the dead. But they did something else, something quieter and more enduring. They reminded people, on both sides of the divide, that grief was universal. That loss was not the sole province of victors or vanquished. That in the act of mourning, there was a shared humanity that transcended ideology and borders. The German civilians who witnessed those vigils carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. For some, it was the moment they began to question the lies they had been told. For others, it was the moment they understood that democracy was not just a word, but a lived practice. A practice that honored the individual, that valued compassion, that made space for vulnerability. The candles burned in the darkness, small flames against the vast night. But they burned. And in their light, a new Germany began to take shape. Not the empire of the past, but something different. Something that, in time, would grow into a nation committed to peace, to democracy, to remembering the lessons of history. It began with a candle, with a soldier's prayer, with a grieving woman standing at the edge of a vigil, watching the light and daring to hope. In the end, that was the power of those small flames. They did not illuminate everything, but they illuminated enough. Enough to see by. Enough to take the next step. Enough to believe that even after the darkest night, morning could come. And in that belief, in that fragile, flickering hope, the future was born.